On September 17th, 2020, the RTX 3080 was released to the public. Now, like most people, I wanted a 3080. And also like most people, I was not able to buy a 3080. Well, at least not for the MSRP. Now, this put me in quite the predicament because I needed a new graphics card. And on one hand, I really wanted a 3080. But on the other hand, I knew the 3070 was right around the corner and I might have a better shot at getting me a 3070. So do I hold out hope for my dream GPU, or do I take the more reasonable approach and buy what's available in front of me at that time? Between the launch of the 3080 and the 3070, I could never find a 3080 for MSRP. So October came around and I got me an RTX 3070 for the MSRP of $499. Now the 3070 might not have been the card of my dreams and it might not have been a 3080. However, it definitely came at a time when I needed it most. I got it at a phenomenal deal of MSRP, and it was a nice upgrade over the card that I currently had, which was the AMD 5700 XT. And honestly, the 3070 has been a phenomenal card. I've talked about it multiple times on my channel, and overall, I would still recommend the 3070 to anybody who's looking to purchase one. So with my 3070 in hand, I took a couple of months off from looking at GPUs, but I always had that voice in the back of my head saying, but you wanted a 3080. What if 3080s are in stock right now? You settled. Go get your 3080. And so of course I started looking and looking, but all the 3080s were well over $1,000, and of course they were still sold out in most cases. So no, I wasn't getting a 3080 anytime soon. Fast forward about a year and a half later, and I finally found a guy on Facebook Marketplace who had a 3080 and he was selling it below $1,000. Now I was super excited about this on one hand because I'm like, hey, I can finally get a 3080 and it's below $1,000 and this is awesome. But on the other hand, I'm like, well, it's also used and it's also from Facebook Marketplace, so can I even trust it? Long story short, after debating with a bunch of my friends about it, I decided to roll the dice. I took a chance, I met the guy, I bought it, and thankfully, and I mean thankfully, the 3080 is legit and it works, and I love it. It's absolutely awesome. So today we're talking about the RTX 3070 and how it compares to the RTX 3080. Was it worth the upgrade for me? Why did I upgrade? And if you're in the market for one of these cards, which one should you buy? So I ran a wide variety of benchmarks on both of these cards. We ran them at 1440p as well as 4K, and we ended up using DLSS quality mode where applicable if the game supported it. I did not overclock either one of these cards. These cards are running their stock configuration. I did not run any tests at 1080p because honestly, both of these cards are absolute overkill for 1080p, and you should not waste your money on these cards if you plan on gaming at 1080p. We are using an AMD Ryzen 5800X. We have 32 gigabytes of RAM, which is the Corsair Dominator RAM running at 3600 megahertz. We are also using an Asus ROG Strix X570E gaming motherboard, and we're using an AIO cooler from Corsair to cool the CPU. Every one of these games will be ran on its maximum quality setting, and for most of these games, that will be the Ultra preset. Lastly, before we get into the results, the reason why I did this upgrade is because I am giving my wife my RTX 3070. I am doing a very custom PC for her, and I mean very custom. So I put a lot of custom work into it. So it's gonna be a surprise. I'm gonna have a video on it in the upcoming weeks. So if you wanna see it, get subscribed so you don't miss it. Coming up first, we have Red Dead Redemption 2. With the 3070 at 1440p, it averages 76 frames per second. The RTX 3080 at 1440p averages 98 frames per second. If we enable DLSS quality mode, the 3070 jumps up to 85 frames per second, and the 3080 jumps up to 107 frames per second. Switching over to 4K, the 3070 is averaging 50 frames per second, and the 3080 is averaging 67 frames per second. If we now enable DLSS quality mode at 4K, the 3070 jumps up to 58 frames per second, and the 3080 jumps up to 77 frames per second. Next up, I ran Shadow of the Tomb Raider in-games benchmark, and the 3070 at 1440p averages 115 frames per second, and the 3080 averages 139 frames per second. If we enable DLSS quality mode, the 3070 jumps up to 145 frames per second, and the 3080 jumps up to 163 frames per second. Switching over to 4K, the 3070 averages 59 frames per second, and the 3080 averages 80 frames per second. But if we enable DLSS quality mode, the 3070 now averages 83 frames per second, and the 3080 averages 110 frames per second. Switching over to World War Z's in-game benchmark at 1440p, the 3070 averages 170 frames per second, and the 3080 averages a very impressive 216 frames per second. Switching over to 4K, the 3070 averages 90 frames per second, and the 3080 averages 116 frames per second. Next up, we have Forza Horizon 5, and this one's a little bit tricky because it does have an ultra quality preset, but it also has a preset beyond that called Extreme, and honestly most people would probably be okay with just the ultra, but I will go ahead and give you the results for both. The 3070 at 1440p on the ultra preset is averaging 93 frames per second, and the 3080 is averaging 99 frames per second. If we switch over to the extreme preset, the 3070 drops down to 78 frames per second, and the 3080 drops down to 90 frames per second. Switching over to 4K, back at the ultra preset, the 3070 is averaging 72 frames per second, and the 3080 is averaging 81 frames per second. When we switch over to the extreme preset, the 3070 drops down to 58 frames per second, and the 3080 drops down to 70 frames per second. Next up, I ran the Division 2's in-game benchmark, and at 1440p, the 3070 is averaging 94 frames per second, and the 3080 is averaging 114 frames per second. Switching over to 4K, the 3070 is averaging 52 frames per second, and the 3080 is averaging 67 frames per second. Next up, we have Horizon Zero Dawn. At 1440p, the 3070 is averaging 98 frames per second, and the 3080 is averaging 111 frames per second. This game also supports DLSS, so if we enable DLSS quality mode, the 3070 jumps up to 107 frames per second, and the 3080 jumps up to only 114 frames per second. Switching over to 4K, the 3070 is averaging 64 frames per second, and the 3080 is averaging 77 frames per second. If we enable DLSS quality mode, the 3070 jumps up to 85 frames per second, and the 3080 only jumps up to 82 frames per second, which unfortunately is less than what the 3070 is getting, so DLSS may be broken on Horizon Zero Dawn. I'm not really sure, but probably want to stay away from it in this title. All right, look, I'm going to be honest with you. Looking at the numbers as a whole, you can probably conclude that it wasn't worth it for me to upgrade to the 3080. However, upgrading from the 3070 to the 3080 now allows me to give my wife my 3070 and get her on the PC gaming platform. So for me, I call that a win. Now for everybody else out there, here's what you need to know. If you're looking to buy a 3070, plan to play at 1440p. The card is absolute overkill for 1080p, and while the 3070 can do some gaming at 4K, it is a tried and true 1440p gaming GPU. If you're looking to game at 4K, then I would recommend going with a 3080 or something even a little bit higher, like a 3080 Ti or a 3090 or a 6900 XT from AMD. 4K is extremely demanding, and honestly, you're gonna need all the power you can get, so definitely consider the 3080 as a minimum. Let me know in the comments below, what did you think about the comparison here? Do you think it was fair? Were you surprised by the results? Is it about what you expected? I'm very curious. Is the 3080 still worth it in 2022? Are you waiting for the 40 series GPUs? I really want to know your thoughts down below. If you're new here, get subscribed. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button because it goes a long way in helping me out. And until next time, E-Rock out.